All right, well, happy weekend. Hopefully, you are enjoying your weekend. Try not to take up too much of your time, but I would advise you as I go through here to take notes, to follow along on key term cards. Remember, we have kind of the orange color or salmon color key term cards for period 4, and today I'm going to go over Monroe and the Era of Good Feelings. Remember that this is a period of patriotism or nationalism after the War of 1812. We have these kind of expansions in our country of the supreme power of the federal government. The sense of working together as a country for kind of the first time to connect the different parts of the country together, to trade with the different parts of the country. And so we see this kind of 5-year period after the War of 1812 from roughly 1815, probably about till 1819 is when we start to see those sectional differences really start to appear at the surface. But we call this the Era of Good Feelings. It's just really a time when there's really only one political party, and that is the Democratic Republicans, or just the Republicans. And we kind of see this as during the presidency, or at least the first part of the presidency of James Monroe. All right, so the first part of nationalism is an economic nationalism. And so under the heading of economic nationalism, you need to write down some notes about the American system. Now, to some degree, the American system was championed by Speaker of the House Henry Clay of Kentucky. Remember, we first saw him as a war hawk in the War of 1812. And now we're seeing him be a champion along with John Calhoun of South Carolina for this thing called the American system. And the American system has 3 parts to it. One, internal improvements. And what that means is the building of roads and canals that would connect all parts of our country together in terms of an economy. It would allow for or facilitate the easier movement of troops if we were to have to fight a war. But really the most important part of internal improvements was to improve the economy and just a better way to ship goods across our country in an attempt to tie the country together to make us a little more self-sufficient and less dependent on countries like Britain for trade. All right, the second part of the American system is going to be the Bank of the United States. So the Bank of the United States originally was chartered for 20 years, and that was from 1791 to 1811. In 1811, the charter ran out, and so for about a 5-year period, there was no Bank of the United States. And during the War of 1812, the problems really showed. We really didn't have much of a way to finance, the war, and inflation kind of took off, and it just really was, not a good situation not to have a bank. And so even James Madison, and then later handing off to James Monroe, they realized that it's actually a good idea to have a Bank of the United States. It's a source for the government to put their money. It's a good way to loan out money to manufacturing, and so they decided to recharter the bank for another 20 years from 1816 to 1836. All right, and then the third part of our American system of economic nationalism was the creation of a different kind of tariff, and the tariff of 1816 was different than previous tariffs. And remember that a tariff is a tax on an imported good. But if we take a look at the earlier tariffs, they were to raise revenue. And so they weren't very big tariffs. In other words, they weren't very high. It was more of kind of like an deterrent, like, hey, we want you to buy an American good, but if you decide to buy the foreign good, then we're going to make a little bit of money on you. And then remember, they used that money to help pay off debts from the Revolutionary War. But now this tariff is a little bit different. This tariff is a really high tariff. And basically what the government is saying is, we absolutely do not want you to buy a foreign good. We want you to buy American. And if you do buy the foreign good, we are just going to make you pay through the nose. And so, this is really what we call a protectionary type of tariff, different than previous tariffs. Now, if you take a look at the graph below, you can see that, and we'll go all the way back to, right before the Embargo Act. And so the economy was doing pretty well. And then when Jefferson passed the Embargo Act, the economy, the imports and exports, obviously, when you have an embargo, it goes way down, and that tremendously hurt the economy. Madison tried the Non-Intercourse Act. It helped a little bit, but not too much. Remember, we did start to open trade with Latin America. And, then we have Macon's Bill number 2, and then the War of 1812. And remember, in the War of 1812, the British basically had us, blockaded. And so it was almost like the Embargo Act. All right. So then we go after the War of 1812, and we see in red where our graph is kind of getting us back to those pre-war levels in that period between, 1815 to 1819, up until the Panic of 1819, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that, that's where our economy is doing pretty well. We resumed trade with Britain. Although, the British are really trying to dump cheap goods on us, kind of like we do on Mexico today. And that, to some degree, that kind of hurt our manufacturing, which is one of the reasons why the manufacturers of the East, they wanted, that high tariff. Okay, so before we leave this slide, we want to kind of talk about, who's kind of for and against everything. So make sure you guys write these down. In terms of internal improvements, the group that's really for internal improvements is the West. They know that this will allow them to get their food that they produce back to the East quickly, more efficiently. It'll help them to get manufactured goods from the East Coast faster, which means cheaper. And so the West was all about building more roads and canals. The Northeast is really against this. They believe that if you start building roads and canals connecting the country together, people will move from the Northeast, and really to them that equals a lack of political power. And so if their population leaves them and goes out west, that's more political power for the West. That's less political power for the Northeast. The South, they're pretty much for the internal improvements. In fact, Henry Clay and John Calhoun, the two guys that are engineering this idea, they're from the South, and that's going to help them in terms of trade for their cotton, getting cotton, for manufacturing that's going to appear in New England eventually, and then actually the South, they would kind of like to have manufacturing as well. Okay, the Bank of the United States. Remember that the Northeast, this is where the bank is strong. This is where people, the wealthy, the elite are in the country. And so the Northeast continues to be kind of the champion of the Bank of the United States. But who does not like the Bank of the United States is the West and the South, kind of the poorer areas of the United States. A lot of these people are farmers. They've taken out loans from banks, and when there's like the Panic of 1819 and credit tightens up, banks tend to call in loans, and these farmers are kind of at the end of that chain, and it's harder for them to pay back their loans. The banks might raise interest rates on them. They might call in their loans and make them pay back. And the people in the greatest amount of debt are the farmers, and they're in debt to the banks, and that means that they're in debt to the wealthy people of New England. So the South, the West mainly is against the Bank of the United States. The South is to some degree. And then in terms of tariffs, now we're going to flip it. The Northeast, the kind of like the bank, the Northeast is in favor of the tariff. This is where the shipping and the shipping and the merchants are. But in terms of everybody else, they're the ones that have to pay for manufactured goods. And remember, with a tariff, no matter where you get the product from, what's going to end up happening in the long run is that prices are going to raise, whether you get the American good or the foreign good. And if you don't understand this, I went through this in class earlier, but if you need me to, you can ask me in class how this works. So the Northeast, they want the tariff. The South and the West, they realize that this leads to higher prices for goods, and they tend to be against it. Okay, so that is economic nationalism under the American system. And here's the Cumberland Road. This was the national road. This was the major road that was built during this era. And there's going to be canals built. Probably the most famous canal is going to be the Erie Canal, although I don't think you would want to put that under the American system, because New York just does this on its own. It has nothing to do with an interstate Canal, as opposed to the Cumberland Road, which is truly the first interstate highway that our country has, connecting several states together. All right, on from economic nationalism to judicial nationalism. Now, what I would do when I go through this slide is I would probably have my book out, and I would probably, take a pause on the slide from time to time and read through each one of these cases. It won't take you that long to read through each case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the Sparks Notes edition kind of these cases, and then I think it's probably a good idea for you guys to go ahead and just read some of the details of the cases. All right, so remember that John Marshall, he is a Federalist. This is the last stronghold of the Federalist Party, and since federal judges, including Supreme Court judges, are in there for life for their jobs unless they get impeached or unless they retire or die. Marshall really uses this as an opportunity to strengthen the federal government and really to strengthen the judicial branch. And he does it through, his interpretation of the law. He is a genius, and, you really have to give him credit for shaping the government, at least the judicial branch, in a way that he wanted it to be shaped. All right, so the first case, and we're going fairly chronologically in these, Marbury versus Madison, we went over this before. This allows the Supreme Court to determine the meaning of what Congress makes in terms of laws. So if Congress makes a law, they can make the law. But if there's any kind of clarification issue on what that particular law means, the judicial branch and Supreme Court's the final arbiter of what that law means. So they get to interpret the laws. Okay, in McCullough versus Maryland, again, this is one where you might want to just stop in your, right now and read in your book. But basically, what the outcome of this particular court case says that states cannot tax federal institutions. So just briefly, what was happening is that the state of Maryland was trying to tax a branch, banknotes of the Bank of the United States, and the federal government ends up saying, no, you cannot do this. If you try to tax the federal government, then you're really trying to destroy the federal government. The federal government is supreme, and so you cannot do that. Again, one common theme that you're going to see throughout the slide is that throughout these decisions, Marshall is really hammering home the point that the federal government, and in particular the judicial branch, is the supreme law of the land, and that states, even though they have their own powers, when it comes to powers that they're kind of fighting over, the federal government's always going to win. Okay, in Gibbon versus Ogden's, the Congress alone, and this is one where the judicial branch gives power to Congress, the federal Congress, saying that they alone have the ability to regulate interstate trade. And so, just as an example, let's say that two states were arguing over, trade crossing their borders. Where would the case be decided? Now we have a judicial branch, a federal judicial branch that would kind of make the states play nice with each other. And so now you have Congress that is a federal group, not a state group, but a federal group, and they have the power to regulate interstate trade, and the judicial branch has the ability to kind of say if that's fair or not. Okay, in Dartmouth College versus Woodward, Marshall establishes the idea that any contract is sacred. And what we mean by that is that if any state enters into a contract with a company or another state, or two companies enter a contract, that contract is valid, and that even old contracts. So like in this case, Dartmouth College had this charter from the King of England. So this was before we were even a country. And the validity of that contract, since it was made before we were a country, was in question. And the Supreme Court said, no, it's a contract and it's sacred, and it still stands true. Okay, and then the last one, in Cohens versus Virginia, the Supreme Court declared that it had the right to review, and if they needed to, overturn lower court rulings or even state rulings. So if a state created a law that was unconstitutional or unfair to the people, the Supreme Court had the right to review that law and then also to nullify that law. So make sure you write down that word nullify. Nullify means get rid of, to make it invalid. So if the Supreme Court, if they feel like a law is unfair, that some state has made, or that if there's a ruling that a lower court makes, they can overturn it. They can, if it's a law, they can nullify it. They can get rid of it. And so all of these things, all of these cases that you see on the screen, the one thing they have in common is that they strengthen the judicial branch. They strengthen the federal judiciary and make the national government inherently stronger. Okay, next, be a little more, we don't need as much explanation on these next things, but now we're going to kind of focus on foreign policy for just a minute. And we're going to talk about legitimizing boundaries. And so this goes into nationalism as well, where we are really starting to see America take shape, or at least, the beginnings of, hey, this is what's ours, and this is where we kind of legitimize those boundaries. Now, keep in mind that the ultimate goal for Monroe and his administration is to legitimize land so that we can go obtain it and we can have more land for farmers and for natural resources. All right, so the Convention of 1818. What this does is it settles the northern border along the 49th parallel with Britain, and it establishes within Oregon joint occupation with Britain, and mostly this was to take advantage of the fur trade and to extract natural resources from this area. So I'm going to fast forward really quickly so you guys can see the map. And if we take a look at the north there, we see the Convention of 1818 line going over from the Oregon Territory east towards Lake of the Woods in Minnesota. And this is the beginning of our boundary that we still have today with Canada at that 49th parallel. Now, eventually in the 1840s, we're going to get the rest of that border through the Oregon country, but we'll get to that later. Okay, the other treaty that legitimizes a boundary is found in the southern part of our country, in that Louisiana territory, but it also includes now Florida. So it had always kind of, as time went on, it was recognized by probably everyone, including Spain, that eventually Florida would be part of the United States. I mean, it was just this little part that was hardly occupied by Spain, and they didn't have much, going on there in terms of economy. And, the United States had shown that they really didn't want the Floridians there. They didn't want the natives there. And so I think everybody kind of recognized that eventually the United States would, kind of take over this area. And to that end, the American government, probably pretty, in a probably a bad way, we sent Andrew Jackson down to basically take Florida, and that's what he did. And so in doing so, he destroyed any kind of Spanish control and, Seminole control in that panhandle area of Florida. And eventually, through some negotiations, we end up, taking Florida from Spain. And that's really how we got it. I mean, yeah, we did sign a treaty with them, but we more or less took Florida, and that's kind of how we got it. Furthermore, as you're going to see on the map, this red line is the Adams-Onis Treaty. And you can see it legitimizes our border and kind of makes it very clear between us and Spain. And so you can see Florida now is going to be ceded, to America, and we have this boundary that runs up to the kind of the border that we have today between Oklahoma and Texas on the Red River, and then goes up and eventually cuts across at the 42nd parallel and goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. All right, so that kind of ends our nationalism period. And again, this is a kind of a short period that we're talking from roughly 1815 to 1819. The year 1819 is sort of a pivotal year. That's the year in which we have like McCulloch versus Maryland. But really, there's two big events that cause sectionalism in America in 1819. And the first one is a financial panic. So head down to the graph at the bottom, and you can see when we get to 1819, this thing called the Panic of 1819. And so we have this economic depression, and it'll last a few years, but it starts really bad in 1819. Okay, it's caused because our manufacturers, they aren't quite as efficient at making goods. We don't have as good of machines, we don't have as good of technical know-how as the British. I mean, the British have been doing this since the 1750s. And so, they are able to make goods a lot cheaper than ours. And even with tariffs, they can really flood our markets and competing markets, more importantly, with cheap manufactured goods. And so, a lot of people would rather buy the British goods, which are cheaper, than the American goods, which tend to be more expensive. And so that's one, manufacturers struggling to, sell their goods. Cause number two, out in the West, we've had a speculation in land prices. And so land prices have been creeping up for years, especially after the war. And then at some point, people realized that these land prices were inflated and land prices began to collapse. Now, this also coincides with a collapse in cotton prices. Cotton had been kind of inflated in terms of price per pound. The British, who had most of the textile mills, they started buying their cotton from places like India and Egypt for much cheaper. And that left us with a bunch of cotton and very few people to sell it to. And so that resulted in a collapse of cotton prices. Okay, third, to make matters worse, when times were good, banks were loaning a lot of farmers out in the South and West easy credit. And what we mean by that is they were giving these big loans to farmers that maybe shouldn't have got those loans. And so the way you can kind of think about it is, think of Mr. Bailey, and if I wanted a Lamborghini, maybe I could make a payment or two. But what happens if, I lose my job or I get furloughed or something like that, to where I get a pay cut? And, maybe I look back and say, boy, was that really smart of the bank to loan Mr. Bailey money to buy something like a Lamborghini? Well, in terms of this, these farmers, they bought money for, developing machinery that's, starting to come by way of the Industrial Revolution. They bought land, they built farms, they built structures, barns, houses, and that all took credit. They didn't have a lot of hard currency for that. And so when the Panic of 1819 hit, then banks like the Bank of the United States, the state banks, they had overlent, and now they didn't have money to cover the things that they had borrowed. And so they started calling in loans. And if you think kind of who's at the end of that loan chain, it's going to be the farmers. And so the farmers, they start struggling. Their prices have collapsed. Their land is expensive, and they have a hard time paying back those banks. And so the economic system was on the brink of collapse. All right, so that is the Panic of 1819. With most of these panics that we're going to talk about in the near future for American history, it's usually caused by over speculation of something, and to some degree, this was over speculation of land prices combined with too easy of credit for banks, over lending to people they probably shouldn't have lent that much money to. All right, and then the last kind of major sectional thing that we want to talk about in terms of starting this division between the North and the South is Missouri statehood. And so contextually, we need to understand that by 1819, there's this very precarious balance in the Senate. Now, the House of Representatives is not what is in question here. The House of Representatives is controlled by the North at this point. The North has way more people and is going to continue to have way more people. And remember that the House of Representatives, their apportionment is based on the amount of population that your state has. So really, if you're the Senate, if you're the South, you're looking at the House of Representatives and saying, we don't really have much power or authority in there. The North has most of it. And so we're kind of putting our focus on the Senate, where there's equal representation. Now, at this time, there was 11 free states and there was 11 slave states. And so they had equal representation in terms of the Senate, and they had an equal voice when compared to the North. And the South wanted to fight to keep it that way. They did not want any more states to enter into the Union that would be free, and that would give the North, power completely over Congress in both the House and the Senate. Well, in 1819, again, that pivotal year, 1819, the territory of Missouri that you can see on our map right above Arkansas, they had 60,000 people, and under the agreement of the Northwest Ordinance, they wrote a state constitution and applied for statehood. Now, this starts kind of a fiery debate in Congress, and more or less is, it's brought to a head by what's called the Talmadge Amendment. And so James Talmadge, a senator from New York, he creates this amendment that would Now, there was slavery already in the Missouri Territory, and there was, certainly cotton being grown. There were slaves already in the Missouri Territory, but the Talmadge Amendment said that that's it. All future slavery would be cut off, from Missouri, and no more slavery would be allowed to proliferate. And of course, the Southerners didn't like this. And so, fierce debate, sectional rivalries are starting to make their way to the surface. But luckily, as history would have it, Henry Clay would kind of come to the rescue and engineer a series of compromises that we kind of bundled together and called the Missouri Compromise. And so the way that it went down is this: Missouri did come into the Union as a slave state, and slavery would be allowed only in Missouri, above 3630. We're going to look at that 3630 line here in a second. But to make sure that the balance was kept in terms of the number of northern states, free states, and another number of southern slave states, the state of Maine was created at the same time. And so the Missouri Compromise has Missouri being added and Maine being added. Missouri is the slave state, Maine is the free state, and that precarious balance is kept. But one of the biggest parts of the Missouri Compromise, and this is going to cause future problems, is that any territory that would become a state in the future that's above 3630. So go ahead and go to the top of the Arkansas Territory where you see the Missouri Compromise line, that 3630 line that runs over to Tennessee and then up the Ohio River, any of that area, and that's a big area. There's really not much left that could be turned into slave states, but there's a whole bunch of area that could be turned into free states. All of that area, that unorganized territory, it was said that after Missouri was allowed to come in as a slave state, but after Missouri, none of that dark blue area could be admitted as slave states. So those always had to be free states. And so the Southerners could kind of see the writing on the wall as, hey, either we take more land, like from Spain or Mexico, or we're going to lose the Senate as well. And so this is going to divide the country. All right, to finish up today, the last thing we need to talk about in terms of President Monroe is the Monroe Doctrine. I kind of save it for last because at the time, it really wasn't that important, but it does become important over time as America becomes more powerful, and when we can actually, deliver on it. At the time, we really don't have much of an army or navy, and it was probably more Britain not wanting the other European powers to come back into the Western Hemisphere who really enforced this for us, because there's no way that we could actually do this. So what you need to think about in terms of the Monroe Doctrine is kind of twofold. One is that it's a policy of non-intervention. So, we are not going to get involved in foreign wars, and we've had this policy since the days of George Washington. So that's why we say non-intervention. We're going to stay out of any kind of foreign wars. And then the other thing along with that is, we're not going to do anything with the existing European colonies. If the Europeans had colonies like British Honduras or Jamaica or something like that, we're not going to mess with those. Those are theirs, and we would stay out of that and not mingle. However, one of the biggest parts of this is that when a place in Latin America, the Caribbean, or South America, when they would gain their independence from a European power, the U.S. wanted to make it very clear that those European powers could not come in and try to regain control. So, if Haiti declares its independence, then what they're saying is that, France could not come back in and try to make it a colony again. And, really, this is more the British wanting its competitors to stay out at the time, and we couldn't really enforce this, but eventually we would. And eventually this Monroe Doctrine, I think you could even say today that the Monroe Doctrine is sort of followed in terms of, we don't let other countries come into our backyard and set up shop. This Western Hemisphere is ours, and we will defend it, and we will keep out anything that we feel is a threat to it. Okay, so that will be a little bit more important in the future. This ends the Era of Good Feelings lecture, and so what I would like you guys to do now is make sure you review your notes, review the key term cards, and I'm going to make the quiz available. And then, especially those of you that do the review charts, probably do the review chart before you do the quiz, and then you are welcome to use your notes on the quiz. All right, thanks, and have a good weekend.